If 10% of the people polled were rabid Jew haters, it would be a problem. 1 out of 10 is a maniac. Where is this Jew hatred coming from? Maybe we went the wrong way with our immigration policy. Bad ideas have consequences. To your earlier question, we originally think of them as though they're just in some esoteric department in the humanities. Yes, they may start there, but then they break out of the lab and they become our prime minister. So beware.
World-renowned marketing professor Saad has been a pioneer in using evolutionary psychology to understand human behavior, publishing numerous scientific and scholarly papers. He's been the associate editor of evolutionary psychology, and he's the author of some big books that have reached international audiences around the world as bestsellers, including The Consuming Instinct and The Parasitic Mind. He's currently the visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University, and today he joins me to talk about his forthcoming book about suicidal empathy and how this concept helps to explain the progressive forces which are threatening basic Western values and principles that we too often take for granted. Professor Saad, welcome to this program.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me, Ayaan. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
It's a delight to have you now on my podcast, which I'm relaunching. But I just look back with a great deal of pleasure on the conversation we had. You are a very well-known figure now in the world of people who are thinking about the challenges that we have today. You wrote a great deal about the things we are looking, and there is this phrase that you coined, suicidal empathy, which is the subject of your forthcoming book. And I have a sense that it's going to cover a lot of what's going on today. Can you please elaborate on that?
So suicidal empathy, let me kind of give the background to it, the theoretical background, because I think it'll be relevant to your audience. Take, for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, right? If it makes perfect evolutionary sense for us to be scanning the world for environmental threats. So, for example, if I see somebody sneezing into their hands and then they shake my hand, I will go to the bathroom and I will wash my hands because I'm afraid to get germ contamination. The problem arises with OCD when you're now stuck in an infinite loop of doing that behavior, right? So now I will wash my hands for 8 hours. I can't get to work. My skin is falling off because I can't extricate myself from this infinite loop of checking and redoing. So what could be adaptive becomes maladaptive because it misfires. It becomes hyperactive. So this is the framework that I use for suicidal empathy. Empathy in of itself is a perfectly appropriate evolutionary emotion to have. We're a social animal, so it makes sense that since we are a social species, that we have compassion, kindness, generosity, altruism, empathy. The problem with suicidal empathy is when it misfires. So, for example, the empathy is directed to the wrong target, right? It makes perfect evolutionary sense. We both have children. For you and I to, without any hesitation, jump in front of a truck to save our biological child. We're less likely to do it for our non-biological child, not because we're evil, but because our minds have evolved to have the cognitive and emotional systems that ensure that we are behaving in a way that is evolutionarily appropriate. So empathy is a great emotion, but very maladaptive when it misfires in this wide number of ways. And so what the book does is it goes through many public policies, how we treat the homeless, how we treat criminality, how we treat immigration. So all of the things, as you said, that we're seeing. And I argue that their root is this misfiring of empathy.
So tell me a little bit more about when it misfires. Let's take the policy of crime, for instance.
Right. So if you come from what's called a social constructivist perspective, which, by the way, is one of the idea pathogens, the parasitic ideas that I discuss in The Parasitic Mind, my earlier book, social constructivism argues that we are all born tabula rasa, empty minds. And it is only socialization that then leads us to do the things that we do in life. Otherwise, we're completely empty slates. If you subscribe to that view, then there is no such thing, for example, as innate evil or differences across people in psychopathy or a proclivity to be a criminal. It must be because mommy didn't hug me enough, or maybe mommy hugged me too much, or maybe it's white supremacy, or maybe it's systemic racism. There must be something outside of me that caused me to become the criminal that I am. And so, from that perspective, it is lacking in empathy for me as a society to punish the criminal. He's already been punished by a unfair society. And now we're going to doubly punish him by asking him to have personal agency and personal responsibility. That's not very nice. We're a kind and tolerant people, and therefore maybe we can rehabilitate him by having him take ceramic courses, and then he won't in the future rape because he learned how to express himself through art. It sounds as though I'm being facetious, but that's kind of the stupidity that you see. So in this case, my empathy toward the criminal supersedes my empathy towards the endless prospective victims. And that's what makes me progressive and tolerant.
You have idea generators and idea consumers in this suicide, the generators of the suicidal empathy. Can I see them as puppet masters that are manipulating the public, or do they really truly believe in the ideas that they generate?
That's such a fantastic question, because I often ask myself whether the ones who promulgate these ideas in the deep recesses of their minds, whether when they put their heads on the pillow at the end of the night, whether they truly believe their nonsense or not. And, depending on the day, I'm either of one opinion or the other. Now, maybe this is a cop out and maybe it's not a good answer or it doesn't fully satisfy you, but there's actually an evolutionary reason for self-deception. It was proposed by Robert Trivers, who is a very well-known evolutionary biologist. And he basically argued that in a social species like us, we are constantly involved in an evolutionary arms race where I'm trying to get you to do things that serve my interest that may not be beneficial to you. And then you evolve the capacity to read my cues to know whether I'm being duplicitous or not, manipulative or not. Well, one of the ways that I can ensure that you can't read any signs of manipulation on me is if I first believe it myself. So by me believing it, it removes any of the possible visual or auditory cues that might allow you to gauge the fact that I'm being manipulative. So I think for some of them, they probably truly believe it, but for others, they're consequentialists and they say, I will be the puppet master, to use your term. So I think it's a bit of both.
It's a bit of both. And then I look at policy areas like homelessness or immigration. And then I look at just the sheer amount of money that is spent via these NGOs. And I can't help but see a vested self-interest in maintaining the scale of the problem just to keep taking that money.
Yeah,
and so it's not altruistic, it's not empathetic, it's cynical and it's profiteering. Am I going to conclude that?
No, I think the more that I live, the more that I think I come around to your view that it's perhaps a cynical view, but it's the old story. The more I know people, the more I love my dogs. So I think you're probably right. I do think that yes, there are many people who are doing it for the reasons that you just enunciated, but I do think that there is a class of sort of lobotomized progressives who truly believe that there is no higher virtue than to be orgiastically empathetic, right? There is the way that I measure how virtuous of a person I am is that anything that you throw at me, I will always be kind and forgiving, right? So the sort of hashtag refugees welcome, right? I'll tell you a great story, which will go into my forthcoming book, Suicidal Empathy. And actually, it involves someone from your original homeland of Somalia. So in 2013, a Norwegian man was sodomized, was raped by a Somali. I don't know if the guy was legally or illegally in Norway. So they tried him. He served a few years in prison, the Somali rapist. And then when he came out of prison and was going to be deported back to Somalia, the gentleman who had been raped by him felt very, very bad about the fact that his sodomizer was now going to have a difficult life in Somalia and he'd have a much better life in Norway. Well, I submit to you, Ayaan, that is not an evolutionary reflex that I would have predicted as an evolutionary psychologist. It makes a lot more sense for me to feel a sense of vindictiveness to the person who sodomized me than I would to feel, oh, I feel so bad for him. He's going to go back to Mogadishu where there aren't many employment opportunities. So I think there is a subclass of people that have been fully parasitized by this orgiastic form of endless empathy.
There are a growing number of thinkers who are concluding that what you are describing is a warped form of Christianity. When Christianity declined in the West, but people still have this, I would say, very strong impulse to worship or for spiritual fulfillment, it expresses itself in these odd ways. What do you say to that?
Right. Well, I do think that wokeism in general is a form of quasi-religion. And if you can draw a lot of very powerful analogies, right? So in religion, as you know, it doesn't matter which religion. It could be Islam, could be Christianity, could be Judaism, could be a whole host of other religions. There are revealed truths that are incontrovertible to evidence, right? There is no way for me to engage the scientific method to demonstrate to you that your religious position might be incorrect because it's in my book and my book is right, and therefore it becomes an infinite tautology. Well, wokeism has similar things, right? Where people are utterly impervious to any amount of evidence, right? And it's that allows us to then espouse, quote, woke revealed truths that are so insanely contrary to reality, right? So the fact that, for example, in the 21st century, we're no longer able to confidently state whether it is men who bear children or women, whether it is men who menstruate or women, where, for example, a person who is going up for confirmation as a justice in the Supreme Court in the United States doesn't feel epistemologically confident to say, what kind of stupid question is that you're asking me, what is a woman? Of course I know what a woman is, and she is that. Well, the fact that that has happened demonstrates that then parasitic wokeism, exactly to your point, takes the form of a quasi-religion.
And this parasitic mind virus, is it infecting just the West, or are there other societies in history or in the rest of the world that are, let's say, infected with this suicidal empathy?
That's a fantastic question. And I actually remember your husband asking me a similar question. I had given a talk, it was during COVID. So it was the Stanford Classical Liberal Forum where I was talking about the parasitic mind. And he asked a question about a historical question. Is this something contemporary, or have parasitized minds always existed, or something to that effect? So apparently great minds think alike. And by great minds, I mean you and your husband. I'm not referring to myself. Look, the capacity for human minds to be parasitized is eternal. It's nothing new to today. What is specific about today are the specific idea pathogens, right? Postmodernism did not affect those who were succumbing to the Salem witch hunts, right? That was another form of parasitic idea. But so what is unique in the current reality is the constellation of all of the parasitic ideas that are unique to the contemporary time, all of which, by the way, Ayaan, as I know you know, but maybe some of your listeners and viewers don't, all of those ideas were generated, promulgated, spawned on university campuses by professors. Because as I often joke, and to kind of channel George Orwell, it takes intellectuals to come up with some of the dumbest ideas, right? So postmodernism, cultural relativism, social constructivism, radical feminism, identity politics, and many other of these parasitic ideas were all spawned on university campuses from roughly about 100 years ago, say for cultural relativism, to about 50 years ago for postmodernism.
And they took hold of the minds of what is now 3 or 4 generations, but I think suppressed first by the events of the First World War and then the Second World War and then the world after that. Now, after the Cold War, I think there was this general sense that all of these bad ideas are defeated. And we didn't pay attention to the fact that they were hiding and incubating in universities in general, and especially in American universities. And I think that there's this sense that it's not just the universities that are captured. Universities graduate future leaders. And so one institution that is, I think, highly relevant, that is captured via the universities, is one of the major parties in the United States, the Democratic Party. And initially, I'm going back to, say, from the time of Obama, let's elect a Black president because we're making history. That wasn't, at the time, I remember thinking, but that can't be a compelling argument. But now, knowing what I know and listening to you talk about the parasitic mind, I think for Americans, that was a compelling argument. And every time you invoke that terrible history in the brief period in America when they held slaves and during the segregation period, that you can invoke that and get this almost magical reaction. And so we elected Obama twice. His economic policies, his foreign policies, his social policies, in fact, I think, but I'm a minority in this, he amplified racial tensions. I think that's what gave us 2016. That's what gave us the rise of Donald Trump. And in 2016, we had Trump and then all the opposition to him. And then in 2020, Trump loses that election and we have the Biden-Harris administration. And throughout, what I saw was the Biden-Harris administration doubling down on this exploiting almost of that white guilt, of this emotional past. Just you call a white man in America a racist, and it had almost this magical, like it was like a spell. It has worn off. It's not there anymore. And you can tell by this 2024 election, if Trump wins, and if he wins by a wide margin, do you think that it's over, that the mind virus is cured, that we can go back to, I don't know, sort of the normal preservation of self-interest?
Yes, another fantastic question. Before I answer that one, and I hate the fact that I'm going to answer it in a less than fully optimistic way, but before I answer that, let me just say that one of the reasons why in the first chapter of The Parasitic Mind, I talked about my personal history in Lebanon is because Lebanon is the perfect end result of what happens to a society that is fully organized along identity politics lines, right? So to your point about politics, and we're going to elect the first Black president, the Lebanese system is called the confessional parliamentary system, meaning that which position you can ascend to is determined by your religion. So, the president has to be, I can't remember if he's Maronite or Shia or Sunni. I mean, there's basically three main roles. There's the president, the prime minister, and the speaker of the house. And then one of them has to be Maronite Christian. One of them has to be Sunni. The other one has to be Shia. So if you were a Lebanese Jew, there was no way that you could ever ascend to those positions by decree, by confessional parliamentary decree. So Rwanda, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, the Balkans is exactly what happens to a society that follows perfectly, in quotes, the identity politic lines. Now, to come to your question, I don't think that if Trump wins, the mind virus ceases to exist, because it took, to our earlier question, 50 to 100 years for that infestation to then make its way in every nook and cranny of society, right? So it will be a doorstop. So when Donald Trump first came to power, I was one of the first to say, this is great, but the fight is far from over, because then Donald Trump steps down and then we can go back to the orgy of woke mind viruses, right? So you need to have an eradication, an inoculation of these parasitic ideas everywhere, right? So, Justin Trudeau still exists, and he may still exist even though Donald Trump might become the president in 2025. So my point is
that you mentioned, by the way, just in this context, I'm so glad you brought Canada up. One strategy of educating the public on why this mind virus leads to rubble, it's pure nihilism, it leads to a destruction of everything we know, is to look at the societies that actually applied it. So you take a country like yours, Canada, wealthy, first world country, and it's without, I would say, and with abandon, it applies this altruism, suicidal empathy, mind virus. And in Canada, it's called multiculturalism.
It is.
And so now, 20 years ago, Canada was the envy of the world. In 2024, Canada, like Sweden, is one of these basket cases. And you think, hey, we're all in North America. If you live in New York or in California or in any of the blue states in the United States, before you are sold on this, just go over the border, take a look at what's happening in Canada. That's a teaching moment. Just tell us a little bit, as explicitly as you can, the decay underway in Canada.
Yes. It's exactly right. You want to see what happens to the United States if you keep going down that path. As you said, Ayaan, just come up north and see what happens with us. So let me give you a few very explicit examples. I left Lebanon in 1975 after the first year of the Civil War. There was, even though progressive and tolerant Lebanon, it was endemic, it was embedded within society to have Jew hatred. And I discuss many of these examples in the book. And then I came to Canada, and for the next 30 plus years, I would experience very, very sporadic, once every few years, some instance of anti-Semitism. Fast forward to the last few years, I think it's less dangerous to be Jewish, and certainly a high-profile Jew, in Lebanon than it would be in Canada. Why? Well, because exactly to your point about multiculturalism, we are a post-nation state. We don't have Canadian cultural values, as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau explained to us. By the way, multiculturalism was really the product of his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Well, today, because of immigration, you let in millions of people within a very, very short time period that are defined from their home societies by their endemic Jew hatred. So you could take, for example, Pew survey results, where you poll people from Pakistan, from Lebanon, from Egypt, from Syria, from all of those countries that are now, exactly, Somalia, Pakistan, everywhere, all those Islamic countries. And when you poll this is a Pew, right? So this is very nonpartisan, probably a bit more to the left.
Yeah.
You get endemic Jew hatred at the rate of 95 to 99% of the people polled, right? I mean, if you had just, let's kind of process that information. If 10% of the people polled were rabid Jew haters, it would be a problem. 1 out of 10 is a maniac.
Yeah.
What if you're getting 95 to 99% that are saying that the Jews are this and that and so on? Now you let in millions of those people. Does it take a fancy professor to tell you what's going to happen to the reality in the streets in terms of Jew hatred? Because now all of the Canadian politicians are, scratching their heads and are saying, where is this Jew hatred coming from? Maybe we went the wrong way with our immigration policy. But I mean, did you really need me to be warning you for 25 years that this is going to happen? So that's one.
Yeah.
Let me give you another personal one. Diversity, inclusion, equity is something that's now all over the place. Well, in Canada, at my university, you can't apply for research grants if you don't fill out a diversity, inclusion, and equity statement, right? Now, imagine the position that it puts me in, because on the one hand, I'm the guy who stands up on top of the mountain screaming against how non-meritocratic, how anti-scientific diversity, inclusion, equity is. Then when I have to apply for a grant when nobody is looking, I'm going to be inauthentic and play the game. I can't do that. That's not how my brain is made. So therefore, it's now been probably 6-7 years that I haven't applied for research grants because I'm unwilling to play along with the game. Well, what does that do? I no longer have research funds to conduct my research. I can't bring in doctoral students to work with me. I can't support master students. So bad ideas have consequences. To your earlier question, we originally think of them as though they're just in some esoteric department in the humanities. Yes, they may start there, but then they break out of the lab and they become our prime minister. So beware.
And you're a psychologist, and I'd say, one of the things that correct human behavior is pain. When you implement these policies and a society becomes poorer, more violent, more unstable, the core identity breaks down, as that's the result of multiculturalism as is applied in Canada. Does that pain, does it lead to a reflection on what happened and a course correction? When is it not too late to course correct?
About 2 weeks after October 7th happened, I put out a tweet that, unbeknownst to me, I didn't think it would be so viral, had gone completely viral. I can't remember what the numbers were, but I think it was viewed 20 million times. It was a tweet where I didn't exhibit my usual kind of optimism and playfulness. And even when I'm dealing with very difficult subjects, I try to be sarcastic or satirical or humorous. Here, it was a very, very dire, somber one. And that, I think, had caught the attention of a lot of people because they were saying, well, if the happy warrior seems like he's lost hope, then maybe we need to wake up. So to your point, I think the thing that makes me most pessimistic is precisely that our ability to autocorrect seems to have been shut off, in part because of the parasitic ideas, in part because of the suicidal empathy, right? I mean, you would think that if a physician gives me a pill to reduce my blood pressure and then my blood pressure doesn't go down, there's an autocorrective mechanism that says, hey, it didn't work, let's autocorrect. But if, irrespective of the amount of evidence that is thrown at me, I'm going to double down, well, then we're dead, right? If the doctor tells you that you've got pancreatic cancer and your response is, well, there is no such thing as cancer, and if there is cancer, it's probably because of the Jews who are holding back the cure for cancer, well, then you're going to die of pancreatic cancer. So I think that's what the West is facing right now. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. But I'd like to be able to wake up every day and feel as though your voice and mine still matters. And that's why it's important to do the shows that we're doing, that why we're having this conversation, because I don't think it's ever too late to wake people up. The problem is that had we solved the problem 10 years ago, it would be a much less violent solution than the one that we will solve in 20 years. So there will be an autocorrection. People will wake up, but the longer you wait for them to wake up, the less likely that it will be through reason and more likely that it will be a repeat of the Lebanon that I escaped.
What makes me optimistic now is this unexpected groundswell against the Democratic Party. I don't even think that the election we are seeing now is so much for Trump as it is against wokeism, against the mind virus. I mean, every time you say common sense, people go, duh. You know? So there is this return, A, to common sense, and B, and now I'm talking about America, not Canada. America makes me more optimistic because it's grounded in Christianity, it's grounded in the principle of free market and political freedom. And I think that when you take these freedoms away from Americans, they are tolerant for a long time. And then they reach a level of intolerance. There's also the Second Amendment. A lot of Americans are armed. It's quite frightening, actually, because if things do get out of hand in America, it's unlike any other place in the world where you could have, it's probably one of the most awful things to have a civil war in America. But instead of having a civil war, we're having rallies. We have, I think it's one of the most optimistic things. The tech community is rising to this challenge led by Elon Musk, and they're reclaiming their freedom. People want back their freedom. Doesn't that make you optimistic? I'm not saying that the victory of the Republican Party in this election is magically going to turn things around, but it makes me optimistic that there is this huge, which I didn't see it 5 years ago in 2020. I didn't see it 2021. I mean, we were really getting into this grim place where we thought, okay, so Western civilization is just going to die without even a whimper, you know, and now this.
Right. No, well, I think the term in our previous conversation, you used tech bros, which I really like. I am optimistic by the tech bros. And since our last conversation, just a few days ago, you probably know, I don't know if we would put him as a tech bro or not, but Jeff Bezos, by simply refusing to allow the Washington Post to make an explicit endorsement of Kamala Harris, in a sense, I mean, he's not as forthright in his positions as Elon Musk, but wink, wink, we could assume that we have a sense of how he's starting to lean. He's also waking up. So, of course, that makes me optimistic because for a moment, Ayaan, close your eyes and imagine. Actually, yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of X, right? Imagine the world we would be in today if Elon had not bought X. And I remember the day, I mean, probably within a couple of days of when it was announced that he had bought it, I had put out a clip on my channel, on my show, where I said that of all of the things that Elon has done or will ever do, I guarantee you none of them will come close in their historical importance as him having bought X. And I certainly doubled down on that position because my voice, your voice, many of the free thinkers' voices would have been completely in the abyss of, invisibility were it not for him. So that, to your point, I definitely feel optimistic that a lot of these incredibly influential, wealthy guys are coming around to reason. So that's good.
I almost died of excitement when he bought Twitter.
I agree.
It is possible to do that, and it's possible. He's just such a remarkable man. I did so once in not even a generation, once in a century figure.
If I can, sorry, forgive me for interrupting. I mean, I haven't mentioned this too much publicly, but Elon and I know each other well, and he invited me down to meet him at his house. We spent about 4 hours together in Austin in May, and I have to tell you, it's just unbelievable. It's almost surreal, right? I mean, I walk into this house, we sit down, we hug, we start having this incredibly intense conversation, both professional stuff, parasitic mind and all this kind of stuff, but also very personal stuff. He's just a lovely guy. So when I see, now that I've gotten to know him, when I see all the stuff that the unhinged people write about him, it pisses me off. Maybe it's my Middle Eastern mentality of you always defend a friend or whatever, but it genuinely pisses me off because you really see how unhinged they are. The guy is such a sweet soul, never mind all his intelligence and all that. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing what Elon's doing. More power to him.
He's amazing. I have met him, and he is. I mean, we talk about authenticity. I don't think I've met someone more authentic and more himself than Elon Musk.
Yes.
And there's so many things I love about Elon, but one of the things that I think sets him apart from anyone else is, okay, he takes in all of these problems and listens and then says, okay, let's fix it.
Yeah.
And it's literally what he is doing now. He is not a politician. He wants us to be left alone by government and all these people. And obviously, in the tech bro circles that he runs in, he then shows leadership and says, okay, let's take back America. And he's going to execute it. We're going to take back America because of Elon Musk. And they threaten him with everything that they threaten the people that they don't like. There was a character who wanted to put it on X, owned by Elon Musk, that Elon Musk should be put, that President Biden should put Elon Musk in prison.
Is this the character who we can confuse as Rachel Maddow because he wears similar glasses to Rachel Maddow? Is it Keith Olbermann? Is that who you're referring to?
I'm referring to Keith Olbermann, and I saw that, and I just remember feeling that what you are describing, that Lebanese, but in my case, that Somali burst of flame, and I couldn't help myself but tweet that he was insane and a loser. But to get back again to the optimism, there was another little video that someone tweeted quoting Van Jones, who works for CNN, and we know Van Jones a little. And he goes, if you call all white people racist and all men toxic and all billionaires evil, and they leave, you shouldn't be mad that they're leaving. And I don't know, it's just a small grain of something, but aren't they waking up?
I think so. I mean,
yeah.
So I so appreciate your reflex to always want to infuse optimism because I think I'm the same way. But that's always, in my case, tempered by the fact that I inhabit the most parasitized ecosystem possible, which is academia. So maybe, Canada. Right. So maybe I'm overestimating the number of lobotomized people because, I love receiving fan mails from the trucker and the corrections officers, precisely to your earlier point, because they are wedded to common sense and reality. I take a lot more pleasure from a trucker saying, I listen to your show when I'm driving from Kansas to Oregon than I do from a Stanford professor telling me how smart I am, because the former, that means that my message is resonating. But, as we said earlier, the people who are educated become our leaders. And I don't see much autocorrection taking place within academia yet. Very, very minuscule. So I'll give you an example. When the Jeff Bezos thing happened a few days ago, I started seeing on my feed from fellow professors, all of them posting how they're no longer subscribing to the Washington Post, right? Because they're basically saying, I don't want to be a part of a newspaper that wouldn't support the candidate that I support. Now, imagine that you feel proud of having that reflex. You're a professor. Does the concept of a free journalism mean anything? Journalistic integrity? No, because they are some of the most parasitized people. And here, I think the person that I most resonate with, and I think you'll understand why, who is one of my intellectual heroes, would be Thomas Sowell, because he's a guy who was calling out this nonsense when you and I either weren't born or we were in diapers. And I wish the world were inhabited with professors like Thomas Sowell and less like the ones that I hang out with.
I think that's also something we have to fight for. And that is either, I don't know, to what degree we can rescue the existing universities and existing departments or start new ones. And here I think, again, online, the internet helps. You've seen the work that Jordan Peterson is doing and others, and then the explosion in independent media. And that is, I think, why there is this push for censorship. They keep talking about misinformation and disinformation. It's just all sorts of excuses to censor us from top down, because the only way really that the far left, and I'm not talking about the Democrats, the moderates within the Democratic Party, but the far left within the Democratic Party, the only way they can come to power and hold on to power is through repression, through force, through censorship, and through this shameless lying. I mean, they'll accuse you of lying, and then they lie. They say that Trump is going to be the next Hitler, but they use the justice system to go after him and go after everyone they don't like. And then they lie about it. They lied about Biden's senility, and then they came round and pretended it never happened, that they never called him sharper to tag, none of these things, and they just flipped it. Who the hell do they think the American people are? And then they brought Kamala Harris and they said, oh, she's Wonder Woman. So one day she's Wonder Woman, and the next day they're sitting there in these panels and saying, one guy said, likened her to a duck-billed platitude. It's the same person within 3 months. So they just this, and they say there are no conspiracies. There's a conspiracy unfolding before our very eyes between these far left groups within the Democratic Party and the media, and they think that they can hide it. And unfortunately for them, they can't hide it because of X, because of Substack, because of all of us making these videos and putting them on YouTube, even because of TikTok. I know TikTok is not a great platform, but still, it's free enough and it's a challenge enough to the mainstream media. And so we break through the conspiracy theories. I think there's a lot to be optimistic about if we are willing to fight. One thing that worries me is that one election victory can get people to be complacent again, to say, oh, you see, I've seen this fight after 9/11, 2001. People were awake, understood the threat of, or tried to understand the threat of radical Islam. And then over time, they just went back to sleep. And there are hundreds of thousands of Americans who are converting to Islam through the Muslim Brotherhood and other activist Islamist programs. So there is always that, I don't know, the impulse to fall asleep again. That's
I agree. And I've actually often argued that regrettably, the architecture of the human mind is such that you will ignore a problem until it literally comes to your doorstep, right? So what are you talking about? Islam is dangerous. That's not true. Well, it becomes true when now it is affecting how your children are being taught at school. So for example, we just had a scandal in Quebec where 11 teachers were caught in a school infusing the official Quebec government sanctioned pedagogy with all Islamic stuff. Well, I mean, I had been warning about this for 25 years. Nobody listened because it wasn't yet. So people don't have what I call the imagination to extrapolate, right? Because to extrapolate into some ugly future is scary. So I'd rather bury my head in the sand, as the proverbial metaphorical ostrich does, than to actually deal with it. But eventually it will come for you. And I often use the example of Bill Ackman, how he's woken up now with, the Harvard stuff. Well, it's great. I mean, he's a very eloquent man, very intelligent man, very successful man. So you want him on your side. But I often say, but why didn't you wake up 3 weeks earlier or 3 years earlier? Well, because he was busy doing other things. And so it is the few that have the capacity to extrapolate that stand up on top of the mountain and keep screaming until the others catch up. But to my earlier point, they will catch up, but then the retaliation, Second Amendment, will be a lot more violent than if we were able to solve the problem 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
So before we finish, there are two questions that I want to ask. One is about your personal life, and the second one is you fight bad ideas with good ideas. And so I'll end with your personal life. Let me ask the bad ideas first. We've talked about the ideas that underlie multiculturalism, suicidal empathy. We haven't really discussed Islamism at great length, but it's a bad idea. Wokeism is a bad idea. You have this proliferation of bad ideas and bad actors and a lot of bad money that advances it. What are the good ideas that we have that make it make an effective combat possible?
Right. So certainly an absolutist stance when it comes to freedom of speech. So freedom of speech cannot be a consequentialist principle. It's not, I believe in freedom of speech, but the second that you say, but, you are sinking into consequentialism, right? I'm Jewish with my own very tragic personal history, but yet I support the right of Holocaust deniers to say that the Holocaust never happened. By definition, there's almost nothing that could be as offensive, as historically egregious, as insulting as to deny the Holocaust, but that's the price that I have to pay to live in a free society. So no consequentialism when it comes to deontological principles that we have to adhere to. There is no, I believe in journalistic integrity, but not when it comes to Hunter Biden's laptop, because if that story spread, then Orange Himmler would have come into power. And therefore, for that one particular case, it's okay if we ignore that. No, that's what made the West great, is it had this foundational set of deontological principles that were inviolable. So that's number one. Meritocracy and individual dignity over collectivism and grievances certainly has to be returned to, right? It doesn't make sense that chaired professorships are granted as a function of whether I am non-binary or two-spirited. I mean, by the way, this is not God's satire. University of Waterloo, which is often referred to as the MIT of Canada, it's the top engineering school of Canada. It's the top computer science, one of the top computer science programs in Canada. They put out a call for Canada Research Chairs, which is the highest chaired professorship that you can have in Canada. And it was restricted to two-spirit people, non-binary, trans women, and so on. So Alan Turing, one of the most famous computer scientists who's ever lived, would have been denied that, even though he was gay, he would have been denied that chaired professorship at the University of Waterloo because he wasn't two-spirit or non-binary. So meritocracy is the game that we play. We don't do grievance stuff. That would be number two. The scientific method is the only epistemology that we use when we are adjudicating between competing hypotheses. There is no Somali way of knowing. There is no Lebanese Jewish way of knowing. That's why science is so beautiful, because it frees us from the shackles of our personal identities. There is no Lebanese way of doing psychology. Yes, there might be an element of Lebanese culture that makes us more hospitable than another culture, but there is no way to study scientific issues other than through the scientific method. So, there are others, but to summarize, absolutist defense of First Amendment, meritocracy and individual dignity over tribalism and collectivism, the scientific method, and if we return to these, we'll be in good shape.
And accountability.
And accountability.
Yeah, and personal anyway, it's all in there. It's all embedded in there. I had the pleasure of meeting Brigitte Gabriel. I haven't seen her for ages now, but when I lived in Massachusetts, we met a few times. She's Lebanese. She speaks of Lebanon with such great love. And then she obviously talks about what happened to Lebanon and how the Islamists there hijacked the whole process and reduced it to what it is now. What makes her history, she was Christian, she's Christian, Lebanese, you're Jewish Lebanese. What makes it different? What was it like to grow up there? Why did you leave? Can you go back?
Sure.
Do you have any ties there?
Sure, thank you. I've had the pleasure of also, not meeting in person, unfortunately, but she's come on my show recently, and boy, is she a firecracker in the nicest sense of the term. You're a honey badger, she's a honey badger. If the world were made up more of honey badger, we wouldn't be in the problems that we are. So yes, I'm a huge fan of Brigitte. There are incredible similarities in our stories in that there is a common enemy that was happy to eradicate both of our existence. Now, there is a slightly worse element, not to play oppression Olympics or victimology poker here, but being Jewish is worse in the Middle East than being Christian. Not that it's a fun amusement ride if you're Christian, and certainly today there's the dwindling communities of Christians is going the same way that the Jews went. and we could have predicted this from history. But I think that there is a unique difference, which is, and I'll answer more generally how it was to grow up in Lebanon. I'm answering now the comparison between Brigitte and I. So in Lebanon, one of the ways that you would most likely to be killed early in the war is they would set up roadblocks, different militia groups, and they would ask you for your papers. In Arabic, it's called hawiyya, which basically is like an ID card, like a passport that has your religion very conspicuously clearly on it. Well, if you were Christian, you might not make it out of some roadblocks, and you might make it out of, make it or not make it, depending on who's stopping you. There weren't many roadblocks that you were going to make it out of if you were Jewish. So in that sense, there was an added horror to being Jewish in Lebanon. How was it for me to grow up in Lebanon? Look, there is an element to what people, the lore of Lebanon, the Paris of the Middle East. It was where all the jet setters were. I remember as a young boy, how the women dress. I never saw a hijab in Lebanon. There was no such thing. I see more hijabs in the first 100 meters that I walk in Montreal than I did in my entire life growing up in Lebanon. And I'm being literal. I'm not being hyperbolic. Okay.
Right.
So there was a beauty to Lebanon. Lebanese culture is incredibly hospitable. In French, you say bon vivant. We're good livers, right? We live well, right? You eat well. You have close friendships. There's generosity and hospitality. All those things are beautiful about Lebanese culture. Being Jewish was a bit more of a problem because even before the civil war started, Ayaan, the writing was really on the wall. That's why much of my extended family had already left Lebanon. We were part of the last remaining group of a few hundred Jews that had stayed in Lebanon because my parents were very well connected. They lived the good life, and therefore maybe they were succumbing to the same thing that we talked about earlier, which is, it's not going to happen here. I'm sure it'll all work out. Well, it didn't. But I could see that even as a young boy. So, for example, when I was 5 years old, I tell these, I'll mention very quickly a couple of stories from my Lebanon upbringing. When I was 5 years old, Gamal Abdel Nasser died, who was the pan-Arabist Egyptian president, revered by all the Arabs because he was trying to unify all the Arabs into sort of one common bloc. Well, when he passed away, I wasn't quite 6 years old yet. As you know, often happens in the Middle East, people take to the street, they start screaming and lamenting and all this kind of stuff, shouting. And they were all coming down my street screaming, "Death to Jews, death to Jews." I remember as a 5-year-old, I looked at my mom. I said, well, why are they screaming death to Jews? What do we have to do with this? And she said, shh, keep your head down, keep quiet. So that was maybe the first clear memory I have of what it was to be Jewish in Lebanon. One other quick story about Lebanon. The day that we left Lebanon, Ayaan, I mean, literally the day when we got out and we cleared the airspace of Lebanon, the pilot said we are now outside of Lebanese airspace. So my mother puts a pendant around me with a Star of David and says, now you can wear this proudly and not hide your identity. But now listen to this. About 2-3 weeks after October 7th, now this story happened in 1975. Now we're moving to 2023. Yeah. My wife comes to pick me up with one of our children who had just played a soccer match in the east end of Montreal, which has a particular demographic group that's not very friendly towards the Jews. She came to pick me up. I was working at a cafe on my laptop. As we got into the car, my son, who was almost the exact same age I was in 1975, looks at me and said, "Daddy, if you wore a Star of David and came to watch me play soccer where we just came from, you'd be dead." So 45 years ago, I escaped Lebanon and my mother puts a Jewish symbol on me. 45 plus years later in Montreal, Canada, it's dangerous to wear that good symbol. So I want to end on an optimistic note. I do think that the silent majority is with us, but I implore everybody, don't diffuse the responsibility onto others. It's not only Ayaan who should be speaking about these issues. Every voice matters. Make your voice matter, speak out, and hopefully we will turn things around really quickly.
And ironically, it's now the Jewish state that is liberating.
Indeed.
liberating Lebanon and possibly even the people of Iran from the grip of those people who were threatening Jewish minorities back then. And now you see a lot of, and they say, some people say it's not there, but I mean, it's really hard not to see it. A lot of Arabs and Druze and Persians celebrating the military campaign that Israel is waging in retaliation of October 7, 2023.
Indeed, you're exactly right.
Do, instead of just complain, do something about it.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Ayaan.
Thank you again. It's been such a pleasure.
Likewise.
And have you again. Yeah. Thank you.